Donald Trump attempted to handle Canada as if it were a subordinate territory. He believed he could insist on submission. Mark Carney refused to shout in response. He stayed calm and composed. Instead, he quietly turned toward Europe and stepped forward into a new partnership. Now the Pentagon is rushing to respond. Washington appears stunned. And it's important to grasp that this goes beyond a minor diplomatic disagreement. This represents a fundamental separation. Over the following 40 minutes, I'll explain precisely what occurred recently, why American forces are abruptly lacking visibility in the northern region, and why Mark Carney's understated approval could represent the most significant statement on the international scene in 10 years. So, what exactly took place? To make sense of the current surprise, consider the events from 3 days earlier. Sources in Washington reported that the Trump administration delivered a stark demand to Ottawa. The request was straightforward and quite offensive. Trump sought complete command over Canada's emerging Arctic deep-water harbor initiative. He presented it as a matter of shared continental protection. He argued that the U.S. Navy required unlimited entry into Canadian territorial waters to counter threats from Russia and China. In essence, he informed Canada, "You're unable to safeguard your own territory. Therefore, we're assuming responsibility." Previously, a Canadian leader might have sought discussions. They could have proposed a middle ground solution. They might have delayed any decision. Mark Carney chose none of those paths. Rather than answering the White House directly, his aircraft landed in Germany. This morning, during a shared news briefing alongside European officials, Canada declared its formal entry into the European Sky Shield initiative. And here's the crucial part. Canada committed to a substantial exclusive agreement for submarines from Germany and France to monitor the Arctic. Not vessels from the United States, European models. The systems operate independently of the Pentagon's network. The leadership chain bypasses Washington entirely. Carney faced the press and stated, "Canada's independence isn't available for lease." He sidestepped the entire American defense industry structure. He removed the United States from involvement in securing the North American Arctic. Consider the scale of that shift. The United States views the Arctic as its own domain. Trump regards Canada as a source of raw materials under control. And now the longtime friendly neighbor has welcomed European forces to establish a presence in the upper level. The Pentagon received no advance notice until the agreement was finalized. The State Department learned of it only when the announcement became public. This amounts to a profound embarrassment for Donald Trump. He assumed he was pressuring a less powerful ally. Instead, his actions drove that ally toward a competing alliance. Let's examine the evidence, because concrete details show this isn't mere rhetoric. This involves funds, equipment, and systems shifting away from American control. First, the submarine agreement. For a long time, the U.S. has pushed Canada to purchase American nuclear-powered submarines. It's a method to tie Canada into U.S. technology. Acquire the equipment, and you acquire the programming. Acquire the programming, and the U.S. holds the ultimate authority to disable it. Carney recognizes this dynamic. As someone focused on data and economics, he grasps power balances. The agreement finalized today covers 12 diesel-electric submarines with extended range from a German-Norwegian group. These vessels are attack submarines built for shallow, ice-covered seas. The total cost reaches $60 billion. That's $60 billion no longer heading to American defense firms. That's funding that could have supported jobs in Ohio or Virginia. Instead, it's supporting facilities in Kiel, Germany, and production in Halifax. Trump frequently emphasizes buy American. Carney has answered with buy elsewhere. Second piece of evidence, the intelligence sharing arrangement. This new European arrangement includes satellite data. Canada is integrating into the EU's Galileo network for precise positioning in northern areas. Why is this significant? For generations, Canada depended on GPS. That's a U.S.-controlled system. That means the American military effectively owns the signal. By adopting Galileo for Arctic missions, Canada signals, "We no longer rely on your trustworthiness." They're establishing an alternative framework. You create an alternative only when you anticipate potential unreliability from a close partner. And third, consider the market response. Normally, any tension between Canada and the U.S. causes the Canadian dollar to drop sharply. traders become nervous. They assume Canada depends on the US for survival. Yet look at today's currency movements. The Canadian dollar actually strengthened slightly. Why? Markets recognize Carney's approach. He's spreading risks. He's protecting against the unpredictability of the Trump White House. He's demonstrating that Canada has choices. Investors favor choices. They dislike uncertainty. And at present, the United States appears to be the least predictable actor involved. Finally, the most telling sign, the Pentagon's quietness. Typically, when a closely linked partner selects non-American equipment, the Pentagon releases a courteous comment. Something about anticipating smooth integration or similar bland language. Today, nothing. Total absence of statements for 6 hours. That isn't tranquility. That's alarm. That's officers urgently conferring because they've discovered a major blind spot in their surveillance network, and they can no longer simply instruct Canada to address it. The connection has severed, confidence has eroded, and it stemmed from one person in the White House believing he could intimidate a fellow G7 country as though it were a failing business. Now examine why Trump is losing his grip here. Trump works from a basic, long outdated perspective. In his view, strength is purely competitive. One side gains only if the other loses. If I'm dominant, you must be diminished. He sees influence as coming through intimidation. Comply or face steel tariffs. Comply or face border restrictions. Comply or endure public criticism. That approach succeeds against disorganized adversaries. It succeeds when fear dominates. But Trump now encounters a different reality. The international community has adjusted to his style. Mark Carney refuses to follow Trump's script. He avoids online arguments. He refrains from personal attacks. He simply restructures the foundation of the partnership. Trump warns of tariffs. Carney finalizes a trade enhancement with the EU. Trump hints at withdrawing protection commitments. Carney secures defense coverage from Europe's NATO segment. Trump resembles someone swinging a hammer at a window that's already swung open, while the occupant has quietly departed. You can observe Trump's irritation in his replies. He shared 3 messages this morning. He labeled Carney as feeble. He described the agreement as disloyal. He suggested revisiting existing pacts. But notice what he omitted. He offered no improved proposal. He made no effort to repair ties. He simply intensified the same tactics that alienated Canada initially. This reveals the limitation of intimidation. When pressure fails, the aggressor lacks alternatives. They possess only one approach, and it's aggressive. Yet global leaders are weary of the commotion. Figures like Carney understand that remaining steady and advancing steadily causes the agitator to stumble eventually. Consider the developments over the past 6 months. Trump insisted Canada raise defense outlays to 2% of GDP. He highlighted it repeatedly at events. He turned it into a political point. Well, with this agreement, Canada has now reached 2%. Carney fulfilled the request precisely. He allocated the funds. He simply directed them elsewhere. It's a textbook example of precise adherence that undermines the demand. You insist on payment? Very well. I'll settle with European partners. It leaves Trump without a valid complaint. He cannot claim Canada fails to contribute. They are contributing, just not to his agenda. And this is where authority truly erodes, because other nations observe closely. Japan watches, South Korea watches, the UK watches. They see it's feasible to decline Trump's demands without catastrophe. They see viable paths beyond U.S. dominance. If Canada, the nation most aligned culturally and economically with the U.S., can reorient toward Europe, then others can too. Trump is losing influence because he wrongly assumed allegiance was permanent. He viewed the partnership as an inescapable obligation. Carney demonstrated it's voluntary, and Canada has exited the premium tier to engage elsewhere. Now consider Mark Carney himself. Understand why his actions stand apart from typical political behavior. Most leaders focus on short election periods. They prioritize upcoming votes. They track weekly surveys. Carney plans across generations. As a former central banker, he led both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He comprehends structures. He masters uncertainty mitigation. When facing an unstable element, a banker doesn't confront it angrily. They reduce exposure. They spread investments. They protect against downsides. To Carney, Donald Trump represents instability in Canada's overall position. He addresses the Trump factor methodically, not reactively. Observe his manner. He avoids criticizing the American population. He consistently highlights shared bonds and mutual respect. His words remain courteous, yet his decisions are decisive. He's constructing a protective barrier between Canada and the current U.S. leadership. He's conveying, "We value America. We simply cannot depend on your current administration." This separation matters greatly. It preserves goodwill with everyday Americans, or at least neutrality, while distancing the executive office. Carney's plan rests on presenting maturity amid chaos. While Trump creates disorder, Carney organizes carefully. He recognizes Europe's urgent need for dependable energy sources and trustworthy security collaborators. Europe fears Russian aggression. Europe worries about potential U.S. withdrawal from NATO commitments. So Carney offers Canada as a reliable option. We possess resources. We guard the northern approach. We remain consistent. Partner with us. It's a compelling proposition. Europe welcomes him enthusiastically because the mutual benefits are clear. This establishes a fresh triangular dynamic. Previously, it was linear. U.S. directing Canada. Now it's Canada, Europe, U.S. Pressure from Trump pushes Canada toward Europe. Pressure on Europe draws support from Canada. Carney has generated influence from limited means. Without superior military force or overwhelming economic scale compared to the U.S., he leveraged location and reputation. He employed those assets to counter the most vocal figure globally, without any rudeness. That's the contrast. Trump seeks confrontation. Carney seeks advantage. What does this imply for everyday people, whether you're located in Ohio, Texas, Toronto, or Vancouver? Why should a submarine contract affect your routine? It matters because the familiar arrangement where the U.S. and Canada functioned almost as one economic entity is cracking. For Americans, it's an alert. Your nearest neighbor, your primary trade associate, is installing safeguards against your leadership. That eventually impacts commerce. Aligning with European rules creates differences in requirements. Supply networks grow more complex. Seamless crossings gain obstacles. Costs increase. If your company depends on components moving across borders multiple times during production, concern is justified. Political separation often leads to economic strain. For Canadians, this marks growing independence, yet also uncertainty. You're moving beyond shared protection. Conditions are challenging outside. Carney gambles that Canada possesses the resilience to endure independently. He wagers the economy can adapt quicker than any retaliation can harm it. But the largest consequence concerns security. We're discussing the Arctic, the emerging zone of international rivalry. Russia establishes outposts there. China constructs ice-capable ships. Until recently, Northern defense was primarily an American-led effort with Canadian participation. Now it's a joint European-Canadian endeavor. Picture a Russian aircraft probing Canadian airspace. Previously, NORAD, the combined U.S.-Canada system, would respond immediately. That remains true for the moment, but project 5 years ahead. If Canadian sensor information routes to Brussels prior to Colorado Springs, delays emerge. Vulnerabilities appear. Trump has opened a breach in the protective barrier. By demanding dominance so aggressively, he sacrificed awareness. This reduces overall safety for North America. Undeniably, when partners cease communication, adversaries gain room to advance. Putin observes. Xi observes. They notice the fracture. They recognize opportunity. That's the sorrow of this period. Trump promotes toughness. Yet by estranging Canada, he has diminished continental strength. He exchanged genuine strategic advantage for temporary online applause. And Carney, out of necessity, turned to the Atlantic for an equal-footed collaborator. Picture this scene circulating from today's signing in Brussels. On one end of the table sit the German Chancellor, the French President, and Mark Carney. They're focused on an Arctic map, indicating routes appearing unified and purposeful. On the opposite screen appears footage from Mar-a-Lago. Trump stands solitary, voicing complaints about global unfairness into a microphone. That's the narrative. One group constructs connections, the other dismantles them. Carney never elevated his tone. He elevated the price of disregarding Canada. He showed that you cannot penalize a nation controlling Arctic access. You cannot coerce a country supplying your energy and key materials. Trump overlooked a fundamental principle: mistreat others repeatedly, and eventually they form their own circle, excluding you. So, what lies ahead? Where does this lead? Scenario 1, de-escalation, the hopeful outlook. Pentagon leaders recognize the risk. They advise Trump, this must be addressed. We require that information. Trump complains, arranges a superficial resolution, and quietly retreats from confrontational positions. Canada retains the European submarines while restoring data links. A tense stability returns. Scenario 2, intensification, the familiar Trump pattern. Feeling embarrassed, he strikes back. He applies 25% tariffs on Canadian vehicle components immediately. He restricts a crossing point under security pretexts. Should that occur, Carney stands prepared. Europe has indicated readiness to counter with matching measures. A broader trade conflict could engulf the G7. Markets would plummet, prices would surge, it would turn chaotic. Scenario 3, lasting shift, the most probable and consequential path. The agreement endures. Canada steadily reorients its security alignment toward European NATO elements. Over the coming decade, Canada evolves from a purely North American actor into an Arctic Atlantic power. The U.S. finds itself increasingly isolated within its own region, regarded warily by surrounding countries rather than trusted. We're witnessing the conclusion of an established order. It concluded not with dramatic conflict, but with a formal signature in Brussels. This is typically where figures urge restraint. But Trump avoids moderation, and Carney shows no sign of retreating. You're observing a contest of resolve between impulsiveness and calculation. The impulsive party believes collision is impossible. The calculated one knows precisely the edge's location. Reflect on the broader timeline. For decades, Americans have viewed Canada as dependable and unremarkable. The polite neighbor upstairs, the courteous companion. That demeanor concealed a core truth. Canada is vast. It holds resources the U.S. critically requires: uranium, petroleum, freshwater, rare minerals. By compelling Canada to seek alternatives, Trump has jeopardized reliable access to those essentials. Should Canada finalize a key minerals pact with the EU soon, as reports suggest, that complicates battery production for U.S. vehicles? It could redirect uranium supplies to Europe ahead of American needs. We're observing supply chains turned strategic, not by adversaries, but by a push-too-far partner. Carney illustrates that modern sovereignty depends less on military hardware and more on contractual relationships. He's engaging in contemporary strategy. Trump pursues an outdated commercial confrontation, and the Pentagon understands this reality. That's why they were unprepared. They assess strength through carriers and fleets. Carney assessed it through partnerships. The U.S. Navy cannot independently secure the full Arctic expanse. They require Canadian shores. They require Canadian harbors. When those facilities host German submarines, the U.S. becomes a visitor in its own vicinity. That's a profound setback for Washington, a setback entirely avoidable. The core lesson: America's power relies on its relationships. Treat partners as subordinates, and isolation follows. Mark Carney has provided a clear demonstration of responding to an America-first approach. Avoid debate, avoid pleading, simply pursue other options. Construct arrangements where America holds reduced centrality. That's the sharpest consequence: marginalization. Trump craves spotlight. Carney is diminishing his relevance to the Arctic's future, and that hurts deeper than any verbal attack. Do you believe Carney is safeguarding Canada or provoking Trump into excess? Does this signal an empowered Canada or a divided continent? Share your perspective below. Let me know whether you see this as a deserved wake-up call for the U.S., and follow along if you'd like the analysis of Trump's response when he confronts tomorrow's news, because the fallout is approaching and the details will matter. This is a pivotal chapter. Stay attentive.